Aloha, and welcome to the presentation, Status and Conservation of the Nightingale Reed Warbler in the Mariana Archipelago. I'm Rick Camp, and I'm presenting this on behalf of my co-authors, Annie Marshall, Fred Amadon, Paul Radley, and Marcos Gorison. Nightingale Reed Warbler is an old world warbler species. Members of this genus are strong island colonizers. It is spread from Europe all the way through Australasia and is a large, long-billed species, particularly concerned with relationship to the mainland congeners. In 1970, the species was listed as endangered under a precursor of the Endangered Species Act. In the Marianas, the warbler is medium-sized, yellowish-brown passerine, and the females and the males look alike, making them indistinguishable in the field based on visual cues. However, the females have a raspy scolding call, whereas the males have a more melodic song. Both sexes defend territories, and the territories are defended year-round. On Saipan is the only island from which we have behavioral and demographic research, and that is fairly limited. Common understandable knowledge to everybody here. Mariana Archipelago is in the Western Pacific. It's made up of 15 islands under two political entities, Guam being a territory of the United States, whereas the other 14 islands are a commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. It's interesting that the southern islands are raised limestone, while the northern islands are volcanic. But biologically, they're all very similar. Here we see an image of the Mariana Islands from Pagan to Yurkas, and it shows where the Nightingale Reed Warbler is distributed, both current and past. The X's are where it's extirpated, and the stars are where it is extant. Starting in the south, we can see that on Guam, the species was extirpated in about 1969. This is due to habitat loss and brown tree snake predation. As we move north, we also see that on Agiguan, a species became extinct in 1995, where the last bird was seen singing, which was a male. Birds were known from Tinian only prehistorically, and we don't know why they are extirpated from that island. Both Saipan and Alamagan have extant populations. Upon Pagan, the population was extant and small in numbers till at least the 1960s. There were no sightings, however, made in the 1970s or 80s, and in the 1981, when the volcanic eruption destroyed the only known habitat of the species, they were considered probably locally extinct from that island. We conducted point transect distance sampling surveys and playback surveys to enhance detectability of the birds. Point transect surveys were conducted on Saipan in 2007, Agiguan and Tinian in 2008, and on Alamagan and Pagan in 2010. These consisted of an 8-minute count that was done island-wide at points that were spread about 150 meters apart along transects. We recorded the species observed and the distance from the observer to each bird. And on Alamagan, each point was surveyed 4 times to determine occupancy. The playback calls were conducted on Agiguan in 2008, and these were overlaid on the point transect surveys. So an island-wide count with stations about every 150 meters apart. This is a 4-minute survey that included a 1-minute playback, followed by the observers listening to see if they could detect any birds responding to the playback call. In Pagan, these same surveys were done in 2010, except they were around the 2 lakes with points 150 meters apart. And in a slightly different protocol, we used a 3-minute survey that included 30-second playback. The survey effort varied by island so that we could get complete coverage. On Saipan, there were 14 transects with 244 points. On Tinian, it was another 14 transects and a few more points, 254. Agiguan had only 5 transects and 80 points, and you can see in the image here how they're spread out across the island. Pagan had 13 transects with 144 points, and Alamagan 10 transects with only 72 points. As I mentioned, the playback calls on a Giguan were at the 5 transects and the 80 points, whereas on Pagan, they occurred around the two transects at 10 points. 10 points on the lower leg and 5 points on the upper leg, excuse me. You can see here in the image where those points were located. Results. We found and detected no birds on Tinian, Agiguan, or Pagan. We didn't expect to find any on Tinian, and that was confirmed. On Agiguan and Pagan, though, we wanted to determine how much effort was going to be needed to confirm that the species has been extirpated. To do that, we looked at the amount of effort that had been conducted based on the number of birds that are possible, N, and a detection probability of getting a bird to respond to a playback or be detected visually or auditory. We then looked at a 95% effort of extinction or 99% effort to extinction. We looked at a range of numbers of birds that could be remaining from 15 down to 2. And what we found is that given the current effort that had been expended on a Giguan, the species is probably extirpated unless they occur in very low numbers. If the birds were 2 individuals, then to have a 95% confidence that they're extirpated, an additional survey would need to be done. Whereas to be 99% confident that they're extirpated, we would have to do an additional 4 surveys. On Pagan, additional effort is going to be needed to determine if the species is extirpated. And you can see that this ranges from 8 additional surveys, similar to what the effort that we had put into for a relatively large population of 15 individuals, up to a substantial amount of effort if the species occurs at very low numbers. Our conclusion then is that on Pagan, the species may or may not be extirpated, and additional effort is needed to confirm that. For Saipan and Alamagan, we were able to estimate densities and abundance. And I show here the previous surveys that have been done in addition to the surveys that we produced in 2007 and 2010. On Saipan, the population has declined from a high of about 57 birds per square kilometer down to 22.5 birds per square kilometer. On Alamagan, surveys were done in 2000 and estimated just over 1,100 birds, whereas in 2010, we estimated that there was 946 birds. And you'll notice that the confidence intervals in the population estimates on Alamagan overlap or bracket the previous estimate. We had conducted habitat use on both Saipan and Alamagan to get a better idea of where the densities of the birds are in relation to habitat. We looked at Tengan forest, secondary forest, limestone or native forest, and then in the residential areas. And in the 2 secondary and Tengan forests, you can see that the densities are relatively low at about a 1/4 bird per square kilometer, whereas in the native limestone forest and in the residential areas, the densities are very low, less than 0.1 bird per square kilometer. On Alamagan, the habitat was divided into secondary forest, coconut forest, and native forest types. And the densities ranged from almost 2/3 of a bird per square kilometer down to about 0.2 birds per square kilometer, depending on the forest type. Discussion. From our studies, we believe that the birds are extirpated on 4 of the 6 islands. Tinian was in a prehistoric extirpation. Guam had suffered a complete collapse of the avifauna, so those 2 aren't surprising. On Agiguan, given a current sampling, it is likely that the species is extirpated unless it occurs in very small numbers. On Pagan, substantial amount of effort is going to be needed to confirm that the species is extirpated. On Saipan, we observed a 61% decline in over just 2 decades, just fairly substantial and statistically significant. On Alamagan, though, the 2010 estimate was lower than the 2000 estimate. The confidence intervals overlapped, and we're not able to determine that the population had statistically declined. There are several threats to the species before they can they need to be mitigated before they can be recovered and delisted. Of course, the brown tree snake population on Saipan is of great concern, and we can see in this image that there are a large number of sightings between 1982 and 2008, not just ports of entry or certain locations, but actually spread across all of the island. The good news is that as to date, there's no evidence of the brown tree snake breeding. Habitat degradation and loss, though, are of concern on both Saipan and Alamagan. On Saipan, there's still a conversion of forest to agriculture and urbanized areas, and there's a fairly large predator population that could be impacting the reed warbler. On Alamagan, ungulates are still in large numbers, and they degrade the forest. To recover the species and delist, if we go back to the recovery plans, translocations and establishments of the species is going to have to occur on other islands, for example, translocating them to Tinian or to Agiguan, where we know they've occurred recently. Thank you for listening to this presentation. We want to thank the access to the islands from the people of Tinian, Saipan, and the Northern Islands, the governors and mayor's offices of those islands. Funding for this came from CNMI Division of Fish and Wildlife, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, U.S. Geological Survey, and the U.S. Navy. There was lots of support, and we like to thank all of the people who helped us with conducting the surveys themselves. This included the cutters and the counters and everybody who got us out to the islands. This research has been published from Bird Conservation International, and I present here the DOI. Thank you for your attention.